Y'all, Cloudstone Curious here, talking about brewing budget decks. I design fun commander decks that play well and, hopefully, win at the $100 price range, excluding the price of the commander and basics. Prices are based on TCG player mid at the time of the deck's creation. The link to the full deck list can be found in the description below. I'm still relatively new to content creation, so any thoughts and feedback you may have will be greatly appreciated. If you want to watch more content like this, help me grow my channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Let's get to it. Today we're building Xyris the Writhing Storm. Xyris the Writhing Storm costs 2 generic, 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 red. It is a legendary creature, Snake Leviathan, with flying, and whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, create a 1/1 green snake creature token. Whenever Xyris the Writhing Storm deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each draw that many cards, and Xyris is 3/5. So we'll really be focusing on that third ability, the token creation ability, or second and third ability rather, the token creation and draw parts of Xyris. So how do we win with this deck? The strategy for this deck is simple. Well, you make a snake, and then you make another snake, and then you just keep making snakes, and then you win with a huge splashy effect like Shared Animosity when you swing, which gives each creature you control, whenever it attacks, +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a creature type with it. So this is very good for tribal decks, and especially with a lot of snakes swinging on the board. It's not impossible to have 10 or 15 snakes swinging at the same time. And since our commander is also a snake, the commander also benefits from this. And if there are 16 snakes swinging at one time, that means that each snake will get +15/+0, which is usually enough to take out the board or take out the pod. Now, you also want to give your snake some evasion. So something like having Wonder in the graveyard. Wonder is 3 colorless and 1 blue, an incarnation, flying. And as long as Wonder is in your graveyard and you control an island, creatures you control have flying, and it's 2/2. So this creature is very dear to my heart. It's by Rebecca Gay, my favorite Magic artist. And it also did a lot of work in Type 2 or Standard, what we used to call Type 2 back in the day for decks like Blue-Green Madness. So I've never really let go of this card. I really love it. I've always wanted to own one, but it was too expensive at the time for me. But now with Commander and it being reprinted several times, I finally have one in my collection. Now, if you don't want to win through combat, there are other ways for you to win with this deck. So effects like Goblin Bombardment, which is an enchantment that lets you sacrifice a creature and deal 1 damage to any target, creature, player, planeswalker, whatever you want. And then you also have effects like Throne of the God Pharaoh. So after you swing, even if you don't have Shared Animosity on the board, this does some extra loss of life, not really damage, but extra loss of life to all opponents. And there are other ways to tap your creatures in this deck that allows you to maximize Throne of the God Pharaoh. And if you have it on board when you swing, you can also just win through Impact Tremors. An Impact Tremors win wouldn't necessarily be a big splashy win all the time unless you're wheeling or causing all your opponents to draw a bunch of cards. But incremental damage really does help with the deck. It's not one big swing always, and you need to look at all those possible situations because you don't want a fog just ruining your day when you swing with all your snakes. Let's look at several other strategies that we can use for this deck. Okay, so first strategy, it's very important that you get Xyris on the board and you keep Xyris on the board. So there are a lot of spells, permanents that keep Xyris on the board, that protects Xyris, because the gameplay or the game plan relies on having Xyris on the board. Now you need to spread the love but keep yourself protected. So you don't want to focus in on one opponent, because doing so, one, gives your opponent a whole bunch of cards in their hand, and two, you're not a Voltron deck here, so you don't try to play like Voltron. You gotta keep yourself protected when you're swinging, so you don't want to give someone a huge advantage. And related to that, remember that an opponent having more cards in hand means there are more threats. Now, if you have an opponent who's clearly mana screwed, is not able to keep up, then you can swing at them. Similarly, if you have an opponent who's low on cards, you can also swing at them. You can use this politically. You can say, you can make deals, attack you and you draw 3, I draw 3, but then you do something for me. So that sort of thing. Just remember that the more cards your opponents have in hand, the more threats they have. Also, since you are a blue player, the more cards in hand that you have, the more threats your opponents will think you have. Specifically, not really threats, but counter magic. And there is some counter magic in this deck, so you don't want to disabuse that notion. But I'm always wary of blue players with a full grip and lands untapped. So keep that in mind when you're playing this deck. And also, this is a deck that's very reliant on the second main phase. More than any other deck, I suppose, you want to cast your spells on the second main phase unless you're talking about your shared animosity. And you want to do that because you want to draw into possible options before you play anything. So when you're playing this deck, also don't hesitate to take someone out. If you find yourself in a position that you can swing and take someone out with shared animosity and a bunch of snakes, take them out. Prioritize taking out someone who's in a position to win or who's in a position to wipe the board. So if they very clearly have a Nev's disc or anything like that on the board, take them out. Because if you get wiped, it's a lot harder to recover, especially if you don't have Xyris on the board. Next, you need to leverage asymmetrical draw. So there are a bunch of spells here that allow you and only you to draw. You need to make good use of that. So don't rely on your wheels or on your group draw or draw everyone spells or effects, because again, as we said, the more cards in hand your opponents have, the more threats they could possibly have. So make sure that you're making use of that asymmetrical draw. And finally, both hands on the wheels. What do I mean by this? You don't want to keep wheeling. You don't want to just wheel anytime, like first chance you get. You have to be strategic about it. If you're wheeling with something like Windfall, chances are you cast that after you've already swung with Xyris, because as I said, this is a very second main phase deck, and you're the one who's most likely to have the most cards in hand. And while you are getting a bunch of snakes, remember that those snakes don't really do a lot during the second main phase. Again, situational. If you do have an impact tremors, then sure, you can wheel. But other than that, you have to be very careful about how you wheel. Your opponents will definitely like drawing the same amount of cards you have with something like Windfall. So let's look at the deck itself. What are its parts and what cards we'll be playing in the deck. First, let's go to mana ramp. So in this deck, we're running several ramp cards. We have 12. This is a mix of land fetches and artifacts. You're not really going to have a lot of creature-based mana. I think if you're talking about hierarchy of the usual ramp effects, for me, top of the list is land ramp, followed by artifact ramp, and then creature ramp, or creature-based mana. So you have the usual suite. Whenever you're talking about green, Search for Tomorrow is really good because it brings the land into play untapped. And Thought Vessel, you want Thought Vessel in this deck, even though it does cost a little bit more, because you will have more than 7 cards in hand a lot of the time. So you want to keep that hand available to you, so Thought Vessel will be really good. And we'll see other effects similar to this all throughout the deck. Next, we have card draw. And as I said, we already have card draw in our commander, but we also need to have asymmetrical card draw. So first, for asymmetrical card draw, we're running Harmonize, Return of the Wild Speaker, Shamanic Revelation, and Teferi's Ageless Insight. Now, Return of the Wild Speaker is really good because it serves two purposes. You can draw a lot of cards from a big creature, like let's say you have Xyris pumped up for some reason, but most likely you'll be using the +3/+3 ability when you swing with your snakes. As again, this gives them a huge buff. If they're already flying, this can just take someone out, and they don't really expect this. Very rarely do people use Return of the Wild Speaker for the second ability. I've used it a couple of times already in my other decks, so it does do a lot of work. And Teferi's Ageless Insight, since you do have a lot of that symmetrical card draw, Teferi's Ageless Insight changes that into more asymmetrical card draw, I suppose. So you swing with Xyris, your opponent draws 3 cards, you draw 3 cards, except that that's replaced by Teferi's Ageless Insight, so you also draw another 3 cards. So it's netting you 6 cards for that effect. Next, we have our asymmetrical card draw. So we have Heartwood Storyteller here, which is really good because your opponents will be casting these spells, and you can draw from it, and your opponents can also draw. And if they don't, then that's still fine. Like even if they choose not to draw from Heartwood Storyteller and you don't get the snake, you will still get the draw effect. So again, leveraging asymmetrical card draw. And another card here is Vision Skins or Skins. I'm not sure how you pronounce this, but each player draws 2 cards at instant speed for 2 mana. Very good. It's a staple for Xyris decks, and that's the reason why. It's a really good card. Very efficient. Let's get into targeted removal. So first up, I consider Counter Magic as targeted removal because it does remove threats by not making them into threats. So as we mentioned, part of the strategy is to keep Xyris on the board. So you have a lot of counter magic here. So for example, Dream Fracture really synergizes well with this deck because it does let you draw a card and your opponent also draws a card. So overall, no card advantage generated, but you do get some snakes if Xyris is on the board. So this is a good counter spell. Another one is Commit to Memory. Commit to Memory is good in this deck because it does prevent uncounterable effects, or an opponent flashes in a Blightsteel Colossus and starts swinging at you for whatever reason. You can just put it back in the library. So it's pretty good. The second part of Commit, the memory part, is also useful. Later on in the game, you can wheel and create more snakes. For actual targeted removal of permanents, you have Pongify and the rest of the usual suite. So Return to Nature is really good in this deck because it is very flexible and it allows you to exile a card from a graveyard. So if you have an opponent who does like Reanimator or Flashback effects, again, Return to Nature is, I think, underutilized in a lot of decks, especially in a lot of budget decks. Similarly, Broken Wings is also really good. For 3 mana, sure, it's less efficient than Return to Nature, but it does take out a flyer. So if your opponent has 1 flyer blocking your Xyris, preventing you from swinging, then Broken Wings can take care of that flyer. So a Chroma can be taken out by Broken Wings. So it's pretty good. It's a pretty good card. So next up, aside from targeted removal, we have board wipes. So here, we do have quite the suite for board wipes. By Force is a budget alternative to Vandal Blast. Sometimes you don't really want to just cast Vandal Blast because it feels bad for a player who's already falling behind to lose their mana rocks. Now, again, there's some level of politics involved in this deck. You can definitely say, okay, I'm gonna take out the Panharmonicon and any other problematic artifacts, and I'll keep your mana rocks intact, just so we're friends, you know. So yeah, a little bit more flexibility with Bifrost, and then also Aether Gale is I wouldn't say a budget version of Cyclonic Rift. There isn't really a budget alternative, but it comes close. For 5 mana, you get to return 6 target non-land permanents. You have to be very careful. It's not as blanket as Cyclonic Rift, but it does prevent you from losing your permanents as opposed to something like Flood of Tears, and it gets you the most problematic cards out of the board, or most problematic permanents out of the board. So let's look at the enablers for this deck. What enables the strategy? And first, so we have these enablers. Tidal Barracuda is really good because it protects your board right before you swing the big one. It prevents any fast effects or any instance from being played. Another enabler here is Diplomatic Immunity. When I put enabler, I also talk about protecting your commander. So Diplomatic Immunity, for 1 colorless and 1 blue, it's an aura. It enchants creature, and enchanted creature has Shroud, and Diplomatic Immunity has Shroud. So definitely more difficult to remove than your usual Swiftfoot Boots, which we still have here, or Alpha Authority, which we again also still have. But you know, you're not gonna buff your creature anyway. So having that on the board, very good for Xyris. Other enablers for your win con. We talked about the rest already, but another one that I haven't mentioned is Chiron Negotiations. When I first used this card was actually budget, and now it has shot up in price. I'm not sure what decks are using this, but this is really good in Xyris, Chiron Negotiations. Initially, I took it out right before I made this video, but I shuffled some of the cards around and removed some of the other threats. I used to have opposition in this deck as well, which goes really well with Xyris. So if you want to build this in a non-budget way, opposition just locks your opponents out, but it doesn't create for the friendliest game. So that's why I don't put it in the deck. That's why it was the first one to go, aside from the price. So Chiron Negotiations is an enchantment, 2 colorless and 2 red. Tap an untapped creature you control. Chiron Negotiation deals 1 damage to target player. So imagine having Throne of the God Pharaoh out, and then tapping this to take 1 player out, and then at the beginning of your end step, Throne of the God Pharaoh basically triggers and makes everyone lose life equal to how many tap creatures you have. So if you have a bunch of snakes doing this, this is really good. And take note that you can tap the tokens the turn they come into play, because it doesn't use the tap symbol. So that's also another benefit. That's another advantage to Chiron Negotiations. And now let's go to the lands. We have Ghost Quarter, the usual suite, what I usually put in the deck. Ghost Quarter, very good, not just for taking out an opponent's Gaia's Cradle or Itlamok or anything like that, but also, you know, if you have something like a Maze of Ith on your opponent's side, which can shut down Xyris, you can take that out with Ghost Quarter. I've also used Ghost Quarter to take out one of my own lands, so I can get another basic for a different color in case you're stuck on basics or stuck on colors, and that's an unexpected use of the card. So our generic mana effects, our colorless mana effects include Frontier Bivouac, and of course, as I mentioned, it's very important that we have the ability to keep the cards in hand even if we go beyond 7. So Reliquary Tower is also in this deck. It's not something I put in every deck, but for this one, I think it's really important. So, final thoughts on this deck. This deck's actually really good. it plays really well, but you have to have some awareness of when to wheel, to whom you should give cards. These are very important questions, very important considerations. I think there are a lot of improvements you can make on this deck if you decide not to go budget on it. As I mentioned, Opposition, Teferi's Puzzle Box was another card that I cut. It doesn't feel as bad to lose to this because you're giving your opponents cards. So you do get some goodwill, which allows you to set up. So that's it. That's my deck tech, my budget deck tech for Xyris. If you like that video, please consider subscribing, sharing this video, liking it goes a long way. If you want to see any other deck techs, please leave a comment below, letting me know what sort of decks you'd want to see built on a budget. Again, this is Cloudstone Curious, and I hope your day's going well.